There's an illegal, outrageous, unconstitutional, and frankly criminal aspect of the government and corporations that are running these projects without the supervision and approval of the president or the Congress or of we the people.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our
Treasure Valley communities,
the El Paso, Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But
we are concerned about troubling and trending irresponsible, one-sided news stories plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these stories simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 The word globalist, can be used in a lot of ways. What it really is transnational. So let me define that for people. Everyone thinks of international. So you have the US border, and you have Canada and Great Britain and Russia and China. That actually is the Truman Show. That's what they want people to think is operational. What's actually operational is a transnational elite that run these projects that they don't really give, frankly, a rat's ass, excuse my language, about whether it's American, Chinese, or anything else. They're only interested in the power and the concentration of enormous amounts of power, and with that, wealth.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control.
I'm working now to try to bring this information, and more equally importantly, the technologies that are behind these spacecraft and things that are being reported on CNN now, because what the public isn't being told is that we have in fact figured out how those objects operate, and that would give us an entirely new and advanced civilization where we would not need fossil fuels, oil or gas or coal or nuclear power. So it's a very big story. Most people think the secrecy around this is because the government has just been incompetent. That's not true. That narrative is a false narrative. The true narrative is that, I will quote from a top secret memo released during the past few decades, but it was dated 1951, and it stated that the subject was the most classified matter in the U.S. government, exceeding the classification of the development of the hydrogen bomb, I'm quoting. So that document, by the way, is up on our website, SiriusDisclosure.com, SIRIUS Disclosure.com. So that this entire investigation that I started sort of as an interest when I was a young doctor, eventually overtook my medical career, and now I'm sort of working full-time trying to get this information out to the public, because it's very critical. In order for our civilization to move forward significantly, we're going to have something better than solar panels and windmills. And the good news is we have it. The bad news is there are sociopaths who are in super secret projects that don't want us to have it. And our civilization has been greatly harmed, not to mention our environment and biosphere. So a lot of people think this is about aliens. I said, no, it's not about ETs. It's about humans, and how are humans going to get out of the conundrum we're in, which is a very serious problem, and move forward as a civilization instead of sliding backwards.
November 12th of 1988 was their dog and pony show, a classified military exhibit at Norton Air Force Base.
And then off in a separate section of the hangar behind a curtain, which was opened up once everyone had gathered, were 3 of these so-called alien reproduction vehicles, or ARVs. The craft itself was hovering off the floor with no landing gear underneath it, nothing supporting it from above. To see something, travel across 12 miles of airspace in under a second and a half, make a couple of right-angle turns, and not make a supersonic shockwave of any kind, no sonic boom, which I've personally witnessed on a number of occasions. I mean, it changes your whole perspective. There are people who've had experiences with the technology that we're not able to handle it psychologically because it defies reality.
And in this document, the CIA director, Walter Smith, says, I am today transmitting to the National Security Council a proposal in which it is concluded that the problems connected with unidentified flying objects appear to have implications for psychological warfare, as well as for intelligence and operations. We have to take a step back from all the jargon and all the paranoia in Star Wars movies for just a minute and realize that it's very easy to set up a false flag operation. Have you been exposed, or did you come across in your career and your network the false INW or the deceptive indication and warnings projects related to this?
Yes.
They could pull it off. They could definitely pull it off. Right now, they have the technology to mimic the form, fit, and function of extraterrestrial UFOs. They have the technology, absolutely. It's seamless, and you could never know the difference. So if they wanted to hoax an alien invasion, they could do it, and they could do it in a way that's 100% believable.
They started doing all kinds of psychological warfare entrainment of the public by staging hoaxed events, such as cattle mutilations. Oh, it's a flying saucer who did that. It's a covert paramilitary program, human. So if you wanted to start indoctrinating people into a false threat from outer space that Wernher von Braun warned us about, you would start staging events that look alien, but that are completely man-made, that are scary and scare the hell out of people. Inner stage left, you got these sort of anti-gravity devices with creatures that look like ETs. That's when I realized in December of 1993 that our country, the Constitution, the rule of law had completely run off the rails, at least in this specific area. And it was pretty much what Eisenhower, if you looked at last speech Eisenhower made when he left office, when he said, beware the military-industrial complex, because it will become a threat if we're not careful to our democracy and our way of life.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals.
That was his farewell speech. And this is a 5-star general, World War II hero, of course, and a Republican. And no one really understood why he made that as his last speech. Well, it turns out one of his military guys who worked with him the last couple years of his administration was an old guy that I got to know and was one of our Disclosure Project whistleblowers. Said, oh yeah, I was at the White House and Eisenhower had been pushed aside and had lost control of those projects. So I think this is the part of the story that people have a hard time, in a sense, getting their minds around, because we all grew up with our history lessons and our civics lessons and the president is the commander-in-chief and blah, blah, blah. In reality, the emperor has no clothes, and there are classified projects that go on, unfortunately, that are not supervised by the president or the Congress. So that led me with Daniel Sheehan to conclude that these projects were illegal. A priori, they cannot claim the rule of law to suppress testimony and disclosure of the subject. So we concluded that we could go forward with top secret documents and witness testimony and put it out to the public. And that's what we have been doing. Yes, of course, Project Mockingbird, and there are others that existed where, for example, the constitutional attorney, Daniel Sheehan, that's in this new documentary, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, he states that when he was representing the New York Times in the Pentagon Papers scandal back in the 70s during the Vietnam War, he saw a document that listed 42 different people who were senior national security editors at major media who were also dual-purposed on the payroll of the CIA. And he felt this was a very significant thing in terms of freedom of the press and independence of the press. And but nobody would let that story get reported because it's scandalously corrupt. Because the free press and the Fourth Estate is one of the pillars of a democracy, and that sort of gives sort of makes a mock. Project Mockingbird made a mockery of that. And then, in my own adventures, back in the 90s, I was meeting with Bob Schwartz in New York. He was on the board of Time Life, which became AOL, Time Warner, blah, blah, blah. And, he was an older gentleman who had, good friends with Mike Wallace at 60 Minutes and what have you. And I was with him at a gathering in New York. I was doing a briefing for a lot of the New York, I hate to use the word elites, but, leaders, the so-called New York 100. And when I was at this meeting, he turned to me, he says, the Fourth Estate is dead. I said, what do you mean? He says, we're scribes taking dictation from the right hand of the king. He says, we don't have a Fourth Estate. There is no free press in the United States on the things that really matter. And then he told me this story. Mr. Schwartz told me this story of his friend Mike Wallace of 60 Minutes was given some documents about these UFO covert programs. And Mike Wallace wanted to do the story, and CBS and 60 Minutes say, you will not do this story. And Mike Wallace went into a very deep depression over this, that he later admitted to the public that he was very depressed. But he said on Larry King, I had been on Larry King around this time, and he said on Larry King Live, which was a post on CNN back in the old days, and he said, I'm a fraud. And Larry said, what do you mean you're a fraud? To Mike Wallace. And he wouldn't go into the details, but this is the backstory. Bob Schwartz told me, look, he was devastated that the biggest story that would have been ever in investigative journalism, CBS jumped in and killed it and wouldn't let it be broadcast or even pursued on 60 Minutes, which of course at that time was the blue chip investigative reporting, news magazine on network television. So that's this is something that's sort of a side issue to what I'm working on, but it's a big part of why when you turn on your television set, even if you get these leaked Pentagon videos that came out, they re-released them this past week. You probably saw them on CNN and elsewhere. Yep. They're not going to say, A, we know what these are. B, we know where they come from. C, we figured out how they work. Let me give you a date that's going to probably curl your toes. October 1954. That was the date we mastered gravity control. Now, what do I mean by gravity control? What I mean by gravity control are high voltage systems that cause an object to what looks like levitate or move the way that vehicle that you saw in that video released by the Pentagon this week. And they confirmed, yes, this is real footage. And they released 3 different videos. What they didn't say, because the people releasing it don't know this, because of the compartmentalization, is that there is an unacknowledged compartmented program that began studying this in the 40s and 50s, and by 1954 had figured out how those things operate. In May, this is almost the 19th anniversary, on 2001, May 9th, at the National Press Club, we held a briefing for the press, and I had 22 top secret military people there. And it was covered globally, but as it began to get covered by the news media in the United States, the intelligence community contacted those media outlets and told them to take it down, and they did. So the other myth that people have is that on the things that are really important, that we have a free press. We do not. Actually, the Soviet Union had a freer press than we do on this. So ironically, there's a really big problem with the U.S. function because of this level of, frankly, corruption. There's nothing else to call it but corruption. And it's an enormous problem because we're talking about a major dysfunction of the Constitution and rule of law on arguably the biggest secret in the history of the United States. And when that happens, a lot of bad things will occur. Things go wrong when things are not being overseen properly and controlled properly. And that's the situation we face.